1000 Miles Up the Nile, Section 45. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. 1000 Miles Up the Nile by Amelia B. Edwards. Chapter 15. Rameses the Great, Part 3. An unusually long reign, the 46 years of which would seem to have been spent in peace and outward prosperity, enabled Rameses II to indulge his ruling passion without interruption. To draw up anything like an exhaustive catalogue of his known architectural works would be equivalent to writing an itinerary of Egypt and Ethiopia under the 19th dynasty. His designs were as vast as his means appeared to have been unlimited. From the Delta to Gebel Barkal, he filled the land with monuments dedicated to his own glory and to the worship of the gods. Upon Thebes, Abydos, and Tanis, he lavished structures of surpassing magnificence. In Nubia, at the places now known as Gerf Hassain, Wadi Subua, Der, and Abu Simbel, he was the author of temples and the founder of cities. These cities, which would probably be better described as provincial towns, have disappeared, and but for the mention of them in various inscriptions we should not even know that they had existed. Who shall say how many more have vanished, leaving neither trace nor record? A dozen cities of Rameses may yet lie buried under some of those nameless mounds which follow each other in such quick succession along the banks of the Nile, in Middle and Lower Egypt. Only yesterday, as it were, the remains of what would seem to have been a magnificent structure decorated in a style absolutely unique were accidentally discovered under the mounds of Tel el Yahuda, about 12 miles to the northeast of Cairo. There are probably 50 such mounds, none of which have been opened, in the Delta alone, and it is no exaggeration to say that there must be some hundreds between the Mediterranean and the First Cataract. An inscription found of late years at Abydos shows that Rameses II reigned over his great kingdom for the space of 67 years. "It is thou," says Rameses IV, addressing himself to Osiris, "it is thou who wilt rejoice me with such length of reign as Rameses II, the great god, in his 67 years. It is thou who wilt give me the long duration of this great reign." If we only knew at what age Rameses II succeeded to the throne, we should, by help of this inscription, know also the age at which he died. No such record has, however, transpired, but a careful comparison of the length of time occupied by the various events of his reign, and above all the evidence of age afforded by the mummy of this great pharaoh, discovered in 1886, show that he must have been very nearly, if not quite, a centenarian. "Thou madest designs while yet in the age of infancy," says the Stela of Dacca. "Thou wert a boy wearing the sidelock, and no monument was erected and no order was given without thee. Thou wert a youth aged 10 years, and all the public works were in thy hands, laying their foundations." These lines, translated literally, cannot, however, be said to prove much. They certainly contain nothing to show that this youth of 10 was, at the time alluded to, sole king and ruler of Egypt. That he was titular king, in the hereditary sense, from his birth and during the lifetime of his father, is now quite certain. That he should, as a boy, have designed public buildings and superintended their construction is extremely probable. The office was one which might well have been discharged by a crown prince who delighted in architecture, and made it his peculiar study. It was in fact a very noble office, an office which from the earliest days of the ancient empire had constantly been confided to princes of the royal blood, but it carried with it no evidence of sovereignty. The presumption, therefore, would be that the Stela of Dacca, dating as it does from the 3rd year of the sole reign of Rameses II, alludes to a time long since past, when the king as a boy held office under his father. The same inscription, as we have already seen, makes reference to the victorious campaign in the south. Rameses is addressed as the bull powerful against Ethiopia, the griffin furious against the negroes, and that the events hereby alluded to must have taken place during the first 3 years of his sole reign is proved by the date of the tablet. The great dedicatory inscription of Abydos shows, in fact, that Rameses II was prosecuting a campaign in Ethiopia, at the time when he received intelligence of the death of his father, and that he came down the Nile northwards in order, probably, to be crowned at Thebes. Now the famous sculptures of the commemorative chapel at Beit el-Weli relate expressly to the events of this expedition, and as they are executed in that refined and delicate style which especially characterizes the bas-relief work of Gurna, of Abydos, of all those buildings which were either erected by Seti I or begun by Seti and finished during the early years of Rameses II, I venture to think we may regard them as contemporary, or very nearly contemporary with the scenes they represent. In any case, it is reasonable to conclude that the artist employed on the work would know something about the events and persons delineated. In any case, it is reasonable to conclude that the artists employed on the work would know something about the events and persons delineated, and that they would be guilty of no glaring inaccuracies. All doubt as to whether the dates refer to the associated reigns of Seti and Rameses, or to the sole reign of the latter, vanish, however, when in these same sculptures we find the conqueror accompanied by his son, Prince Amenhotep, who is of an age not only to bear his part in the field, but afterwards to conduct an important ceremony of state on the occasion of the submission and tribute offering of the Ethiopian commander. Such is the unmistakable evidence of the bas-reliefs at Beit el-Weli, as those who cannot go to Beit el-Weli may see and judge for themselves by means of the admirable casts of these great tableaux which line the walls of the second Egyptian room at the British Museum. To explain away Prince Amenhotep would be difficult. We are accustomed to a certain amount of courtly exaggeration on the part of those who record with pen or pencil the great deeds of the pharaohs. We expect to see the king always young, always beautiful, always victorious. It seems only right and natural that he should never be less than 20, and sometimes more than 60 feet in height. But that any flatterer should go so far as to credit a lad of 13 with a son at least as old as himself is surely quite incredible. Lastly, there is the evidence of the Bible. Joseph being dead and the Israelites established in Egypt, there comes to the throne a Pharaoh who takes alarm at the increase of this alien race, and who seeks to check their too rapid multiplication. He not only oppresses the foreigners, but ordains that every male infant born to them in their bondage shall be cast into the river. This Pharaoh is now universally believed to be Rameses II. Then comes the old, sweet, familiar Bible story that we know so well. Moses is born, cast adrift in the ark of bulrushes, and rescued by the king's daughter. He becomes to her as a son. Although no dates are given, it is clear that the new Pharaoh has not been long upon the throne when these events happen. It is equally clear that he is no mere youth. He is old in the uses of statecraft, and he is the father of a princess of whom it is difficult to suppose that she herself was an infant. On the whole, then, we can but conclude that Rameses II, though born a king, was not merely grown to manhood, but wedded and the father of children already past the period of infancy, before he succeeded to the sole exercise of sovereign power. This is, at all events, the view taken by Professor Maspero, who expressly says, in the latest edition of his Histoire Ancienne, that Rameses II, when he received news of the death of his father, was then in the prime of life, and surrounded by a large family, some of whom were of an age to fight under his command. Brugsch places the birth of Moses in the 6th year of the reign of Rameses II. This may very well be. The 80 years that elapsed between that time and the time of the Exodus correspond with sufficient exactness to the chronological data furnished by the monuments. Moses would thus see out the 61 remaining years of the king's long life, and release the Israelites from bondage towards the close of the reign of Meneptah, who sat for about 20 years on the throne of his fathers. The correspondence of dates this time leaves nothing to be desired. The Sesostris of Diodorus Siculus went blind, and died by his own hand, which act, says the historian, as it is conformed to the glory of his life, was greatly admired by his people. We are here evidently in the region of pure fable. Suicide was by no means an Egyptian but a classical virtue. Just as the Greeks hated age, the Egyptians reverenced it, and it may be doubted whether a people who seem always to have passionately desired length of days would have seen anything to admire in a wilful shortening of that most precious gift of the gods. With the one exception of Cleopatra, the death of Nicotis the rosy-cheeked being also of Greek, and therefore questionable origin, no Egyptian sovereign is known to have committed suicide, and even Cleopatra, who was half Greek by birth, must have been influenced to the act by Greek and Roman example. Dismissing, then, altogether this legend of blindness and self-slaughter, it must be admitted that of the death of Rameses II we know nothing certain. Such are, very briefly, the leading facts of the history of this famous pharaoh. Exhaustively treated, they would expand into a volume. Even then, however, one would ask, and ask in vain, what manner of man he was. Every attempt to evolve his personal character from these scanty data is, in fact, a mere exercise of fancy. That he was personally valiant may be gathered, with due reservation, from the poem of Pentar, and that he was not unmerciful is shown in the extradition clause of the Khetton Treaty. His pride was evidently boundless. Every temple which he erected was a monument to his own glory, every colossus was a trophy, every inscription a paean of self-praise. At Abu Simbel, at Dur, at Gerf Hassain, he seated his own image in the sanctuary among the images of the gods. There are even instances in which he is depicted under the twofold aspect of royalty and divinity, Rameses the Pharaoh burning incense before Rameses the deity. For the rest, it is safe to conclude that he was neither better nor worse than the general run of Oriental despots, that he was ruthless in war, prodigal in peace, rapacious of booty, and unsparing in the exercise of almost boundless power. Such pride and such despotism were, however, in strict accordance with immemorial precedent, and with the temper of the age in which he lived. The Egyptians would seem, beyond all doubt, to have believed that their king was always, in some sense, divine. They wrote hymns and offered up prayers to him, and regarded him as the living representative of deity. His princes and ministers habitually addressed him in the language of worship. Even his wives, who ought to have known better, are represented in the performance of acts of religious adoration before him. What wonder, then, if the man so deified believed himself a god? End of section 45.